My mother-in-law secretly signed the deed to a 4-bedroom colonial for my husband and his pregnant mistress, using the life savings I bled to build. I didn't cry, and I didn't shout. I calmly froze every asset, initiated a forensic audit, and called my legal team. 72 hours later, their entire world collapsed and I never saw it coming. They say love is blind, but I think it's more accurate to say that love is a masterclass in willful ignorance. You don't ignore the red flags because you can't see them. You ignore them because the alternative means admitting you were foolish enough to let a parasite into your home. My parasite was named Marcus, and the host that fed him before I came along was his mother, Sylvia. Marcus was 34, handsome in that effortlessly hollow way, and possessed a quiet charm that masked a terrifying lack of ambition. When we met, I was 28, fresh off selling my first successful tech startup, flush with capital, and starved for the kind of simple, uncomplicated affection he offered. I was the earner, the planner, the engine of our lives. He was the passenger. For a long time, I convinced myself that this was balance. But you never just marry the passenger. You marry their entire luggage. Sylvia was a woman who wore her entitlement like a vintage Chanel suit, threadbare if you looked closely, but weaponized to demand respect. To Sylvia, Marcus wasn't just a son. He was the golden child, the undeniable center of the universe, a fragile genius who simply hadn't been discovered yet. The fact that his resume consisted of failed entrepreneurial ventures and brief stints at marketing firms that ended in mutual separations was never his fault. It was the economy. It was toxic management. It was everyone else. And then there was me. To Marcus, I was a life partner. To Sylvia, I was a very convenient, very lucrative scholarship program for her son's lifestyle. I tolerated her. I let her make the backhanded comments about my long working hours. I swallowed the humiliation when she told extended family at Thanksgiving that Marcus was the real brain behind my commercial real estate firm, simply because he had once suggested, "We use a different shade of gray for a lobby rendering." I kept my peace. I maintained the boundaries I thought were solid. But boundaries with people like Sylvia are just hurdles they haven't figured out how to jump yet. Let me explain the financial architecture of our marriage, because that's where the blood is buried. I am not a stupid woman. I had a prenuptial agreement drafted by a lawyer whose hourly rate could make you weep. My primary business, a boutique development firm, was structured as an LLC entirely in my name. Marcus had the equity, the voting rights, and the access to the operating accounts. However, for the sake of marital harmony, we had the life account. It was a joint checking and high-yield savings account where I deposited 30% of my monthly draw. This was meant for the mortgage on our primary residence, groceries, utilities, vacations, and Marcus's modest allowance, though we called it his discretionary fund to protect his fragile ego. Over 5 years of marriage, that savings account had swelled to just shy of $400,000. It was our safety net, or so I thought. The first drop in the bucket of my realization happened on a rainy Tuesday in October. I was reviewing some personal bank statements, a task I usually left to my accountant, but I was looking for a specific receipt for a charitable donation. I noticed a withdrawal from the high-yield savings, $40,000. The description simply read, "Wire transfer escrow." My blood ran cold. $40,000 is not a typo. It is not a misplaced decimal. It is a very deliberate, very specific amount of money. I called Marcus. He didn't pick up. He was supposedly at a networking retreat in Sedona, trying to launch a boutique consulting firm that he had been talking about for 3 years. I didn't panic. Panic is for people who don't have leverage. Instead, I opened my laptop and started digging. I traced the wire transfer. It had gone to a title company based in a wealthy suburb about an hour away from where we lived, a suburb where Sylvia just so happened to reside. I called the bank to request the wire authorization forms. As a joint account holder, I had every right to them. Within an hour, the PDF was sitting in my inbox. The signature on the authorization was Marcus's. The memo line read, "Gift funds down payment." Gift funds. For whom? The pieces began to click together with sickening precision. Sylvia had been dropping hints for months about downsizing and finding a place that had room for family. I had assumed she meant a guest room for when we visited. I was wrong. I drove to the address associated with the title company's recent transactions under Sylvia's name. It is a matter of public record if you know where to look. County clerk websites are a treasure trove of betrayal if you have the patience to search. It was a gorgeous, 4-bedroom colonial house with a wraparound porch and a freshly manicured lawn. There was a car in the driveway. It wasn't Sylvia's aging Mercedes. It was a sleek white Range Rover, the exact model Marcus had been drooling over for months. The one I told him we weren't buying until he actually secured a client. I parked across the street. I watched. The front door opened. Out walked Sylvia, carrying a tray of iced teas. And then out walked Marcus, my husband, the man supposedly meditating in Sedona. But it was the third person who made my heart completely stop before it restarted with a cold, mechanical rhythm. It was a woman, perhaps 5 years younger than me. She was laughing, resting a hand on Marcus's arm. And she was visibly, undeniably, heavily pregnant. Sylvia handed the pregnant woman a glass of tea and patted her stomach with a look of absolute adoration, a look she had never, not once, directed at me. Marcus leaned down and kissed the woman's cheek. They looked like a perfect, happy family. Standing on the porch of a house bought with my money. I sat in my car for 20 minutes. I didn't storm the lawn. I didn't march up there and demand answers. If you confront a parasite in the open, it just scurries into the floorboards and hides. No, if you want to eliminate an infestation, you have to seal all the exits first. I put the car in drive and quietly drove away. The old Alina, the naive girl who wanted to be loved, died in that driver's seat. The woman who pulled into my driveway an hour later was a completely different entity. I was an architect, and I was about to design the total, systematic demolition of their lives. I didn't cry. I took action. The moment I stepped inside my house, the mourning period was officially over. I had a task. I needed an airtight paper trail, and I needed it before Marcus returned from his imaginary business trip. Panic is an emotion for the unprepared. I was building a guillotine, and I needed to make sure the blade was perfectly sharpened. First, the money. A joint account is legally accessible by both parties. He had taken $40,000. I took the remaining $360,000. I drove to the bank, sat in the pristine glass office of the branch manager, and initiated a cashier's check for the full remaining balance. I immediately deposited those funds into a new, individual account at a completely different institution under a newly formed holding trust. I left exactly $100 in our joint checking account. It was enough to keep the account open, and enough to send a very specific message when the time was right. Next, the credit lines. Marcus had supplementary cards on my Platinum, American Express, and my Chase Sapphire Reserve. He used them for exorbitant client dinners that miraculously never yielded any actual clients. I logged into the secure portals and suspended them. I didn't cancel them outright, I suspended them. I wanted the plastic to physically decline at the register. I wanted him to experience the embarrassment of a rejected card in public, rather than tipping him off via an automated cancellation email. Then I called Diane. Diane was a high-net-worth divorce attorney whose reputation in our city was less legal counsel and more nuclear deterrent. We met the following morning in her mahogany-paneled office. I laid out the brutal facts. The secret house. The pregnant mistress. The $40,000 wire transfer. Diane didn't blink. She just started writing on her legal pad. "This is textbook marital dissipation of assets," she said, her pen scratching rhythmically. "You'll get that $40,000 back in the equity split. But what I'm actually interested in is the financing. A down payment of $40,000 on a colonial in Sylvia's zip code means the purchase price is easily over $800,000. Marcus doesn't have the W-2 employment history to qualify for a mortgage of that size. Sylvia's retirement portfolio certainly doesn't cover the debt-to-income ratio. That was the puzzle piece I was missing. How did they buy it? I hired a private investigator. Within 48 hours, he handed me a thick manila folder that laid bare the sheer audacity of my husband and his mother. The mistress's name was Chloe. She was 25, a part-time Pilates instructor whose social media was suddenly flooded with photos of baby clothes and cryptic, glowing captions about new beginnings and ending my forever. Sylvia had orchestrated the entire arrangement. She had always deeply resented my focus on my career. She wanted a legacy. She wanted the golden grandchild. And since I was too busy building a commercial real estate empire to immediately provide one, she found a compliant girl who would. Sylvia had co-signed the mortgage with Marcus. But to get the bank's approval, Marcus had done something incredibly foolish. He had submitted doctored financial statements. He had taken my LLC's K-1 tax forms, digitally altered the federal documents to replace my name with his, and presented my company's gross revenue as his personal income to the more T-gauge underwriters. I let out a short, humorless laugh when Diane explained the implications to me. Infidelity is a civil marital issue. Forging federal tax documents to secure a fraudulent mortgage loan across state lines? That is a federal felony. It is wire fraud. It is bank fraud. He hadn't just cheated on me. He had handed me a loaded weapon and painted a target on his own chest. I spent the next 3 days meticulously archiving everything. I downloaded every bank statement, every email, every text message I could access from our shared iCloud family plan, which he had foolishly left synced to the home desktop. The gaslighting was breathtaking. In his text to Chloe, Marcus painted me as an abusive, financially controlling monster. He claimed we had been legally separated for a year, sleeping in separate bedrooms, and that my petty refusal to sign the divorce papers was the only thing keeping them from being a true family. He was playing the tragic, trapped victim. Sylvia was playing the benevolent, supportive matriarch, and Chloe was playing the naive, rescuing angel. On Friday evening, Marcus finally came home from Sedona. He walked through the front door, dropping his expensive leather duffel bag on the hardwood floor. He looked tanned, relaxed, and entirely too pleased with himself. "Hey, babe," he called out, heading straight toward the kitchen. Flight was brutal. "Did you pick up my dry cleaning?" I was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a glass of sparkling water. I looked at the man I had slept next to for 5 years. I felt absolutely nothing. The love had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical precision. "I didn't get to the dry cleaners, no," I said. "How was the desert?" He launched into a practiced, animated monologue about synergy, networking, and a potential angel investor he had supposedly met over drinks. He lied with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who truly believed his own fiction. I let him talk. I nodded in all the right places. I smiled. I let him think he was the smartest person in the room. It's the easiest way to catch a narcissist. Let them build their own pedestal. It just makes the inevitable fall that much longer. "Oh, by the way," Marcus said casually, opening the fridge and grabbing a beer. "My mother invited us over for Sunday dinner this weekend. She's hosting a little get-together. Extended family. Wants to make a special announcement about her estate planning or something. You know how she gets. A special announcement. Of course. Sylvia couldn't just have her secret victory in the shadows. She needed an audience. She was planning to use a family gathering to slowly start introducing the idea of Marcus's new chapter to the relatives, likely positioning me as the villain on my way out. She fully expected me to decline the invitation, as I usually did when her side of the family gathered to worship at the altar of her ego. But this time was different. "Sunday dinner," I repeated softly. "At your mother's." "Sounds lovely." He paused, the beer bottle halfway to his mouth. He looked genuinely surprised. "You want to come?" I wouldn't miss it for the world. Sunday morning arrived with the crisp, unforgiving clarity of an autumn frost. I woke up at 6, went for a 5-mile run, and drank my coffee black. I felt an immense, almost terrifying sense of calm. When you finally stop trying to save a burning building, you can just stand back and appreciate the architecture of the flames. Today was the day the structure would fall. I dressed with deliberate, calculated precision. No power suits that would signal defense in anticipation of an attack. I chose a tailored navy silk dress, understated but dripping in quiet, unassailable wealth. I wore the diamond tennis bracelet Marcus had supposedly bought me for our 3rd anniversary, though I had quietly paid the credit card statement it appeared on. It was my armor. It was a physical reminder that everything he presented to the world was underwritten by my labor. Marcus spent the morning pacing the hardwood hallway, shooting me nervous, sideways glances. He was a man accustomed to his wife creating friction at these family gatherings by simply existing and refusing to applaud his mediocrity. My serene silence was unnerving him. He kept checking his phone, sliding it quickly into his pocket whenever I walked past. "Are you feeling okay?" he asked as we got into my Porsche. He didn't even try to take the keys. He knew better. "You're awfully quiet today. Just please don't get into it with my mother about the consulting business. Let her have her moment. You know how she is." "I have no intention of getting into anything with your mother, Marcus," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly detached. "Today is entirely about her. And you." He exhaled, visibly relieved, completely misinterpreting my statement as submission. The drive was 30 minutes of him listening to a podcast on venture capital, absorbing buzzwords he would undoubtedly regurgitate later to sound competent. Sylvia lived in a sprawling, ostentatious Tudor-style home that she had stubbornly refused to leave after Marcus's father passed away, despite complaining constantly about the financial burden of its upkeep. When we pulled into the circular driveway, the place was already packed with vehicles. The entire ensemble of enablers was present. There was Aunt Beatrice, who believed Marcus was a misunderstood creative genius. Uncle Richard, who always asked me for free commercial real estate advice while simultaneously implying my success was a fluke, and a scattering of cousins who orbited Sylvia for the occasional check she wrote to cover their own poor life choices. Walking into that house was like stepping onto a stage where everyone else had the script but me. Only today, I was the one holding the pen and I had rewritten the ending. Sylvia met us in the grand foyer. She wore a suffocating amount of heavy floral perfume and a smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Eleanor," she said, offering a heavily powdered cheek that I bypassed, opting instead for a polite, sterile nod. "I am absolutely shocked you made it. I told everyone you'd be too busy with your little office spreadsheets to join a family Sunday. It's so rare you grace us with your presence." "I cleared my schedule, Sylvia," I said, handing my cashmere coat to the maid. "Some occasions are simply too important to miss. I wouldn't dream of being anywhere else." Sylvia eyed me suspiciously, her gaze flicking over my shoulder to Marcus, who offered her a tight, conspiratorial smile. They shared a silent communication, a shared, arrogant belief that they were the apex predators in the room, successfully stringing along the clueless, workaholic wife. The afternoon bled into early evening, serving as a masterclass in superficiality. I nursed a single glass of expensive Pinot Noir and observed them all. I watched Marcus excuse himself to the powder room 3 times in 2 hours, clutching his phone like a lifeline. I knew exactly who he was texting. I had already checked the carrier logs online before we left our house. Chloe was demanding attention, likely anxious and nesting in the colonial house I had inadvertently financed. At 6 o'clock sharp, we were ushered into the formal dining room. The massive mahogany table was set for 14. I was seated at the far end, geographically isolated from Sylvia, who held court at the head, with Marcus to her immediate right. The golden child, sitting at the right hand of the matriarch. It was almost biblical in its suffocating cliché. Over roast lamb and heavily buttered asparagus, the conversation was predictably dominated by Marcus. He was holding court, regaling Uncle Richard with hollow phrases about market disruption, synergistic paradigms, and leveraging assets. It was agonizingly transparent. Anyone with a modicum of genuine business acumen could see he was peddling vapor, but in this room, shielded by his mother's adoration, he was a titan of industry. I ate in silence. I chewed my food. I swallowed. I felt the heavy, satisfying weight of the leather portfolio resting in my designer tote bag on the floor next to my chair. Inside that portfolio were 14 copies of a meticulously compiled dossier. Each dossier contained the $40,000 wire transfer receipt, the property deed of the colonial, crisp color photos of pregnant Chloe standing on the porch, and, most importantly, the fraudulent loan application bearing my company's altered K-1 tax statements. Dessert was served, a towering pavlova that Sylvia loudly insisted she had made from scratch, though I had seen the upscale bakery box sitting in the recycling bin on my way to the restroom. As the dessert plates were cleared and coffee was poured into delicate china cups, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew thick. Marcus sat up straighter, smoothing his silk tie. Sylvia tapped her silver spoon against her crystal water goblet. Clink, clink, clink. The dull roar of family chatter died down. 14 faces turned toward the head of the table. "Family," Sylvia began, her voice taking on a theatrical, magnanimous timbre. She stood up, placing her hands flat on the polished mahogany table. "I asked you all here today because we are on the precipice of a new era. As you all know, my dear Marcus has been working so incredibly hard to build a life of substance and meaning. And sometimes, building the right life means making difficult, necessary transitions to find true happiness." She paused, letting the dramatic weight of her words settle over the room. She looked directly down the length of the table at me. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She thought this was her checkmate. She thought she was about to publicly shame me, announce his impending divorce, and perhaps even hint at the new grandchild, painting herself and Marcus as the brave victims of my cold, loveless ambition. She was ready to launch the smear campaign. "Marcus has a very special announcement to make," Sylvia continued, turning to her son with a sickeningly sweet, encouraging smile. "Go ahead, darling. Tell them about your new chapter." Marcus stood up. He cleared his throat, adjusting his collar. He looked at the sea of expectant faces, deliberately avoiding my gaze entirely. "Well," Marcus started, a nervous flush creeping up his neck. "As Mom said, it's been a year of heavy reflection. Eleanor and I have been growing apart for a long time, and I've recently finalized the purchase of a new property. A place to start fresh, to build a real family." A collective gasp rippled through the aunts and cousins. Whispers ignited like dry brush. Uncle Richard looked at me with thinly veiled pity, shaking his head. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I reached down, unzipped my tote bag, and pulled out the thick stack of manila envelopes. I stood up slowly, the legs of my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, cutting through their whispers. "A new property indeed," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, absolute authority. I walked over to Aunt Beatrice and handed her an envelope. "What is this?" Beatrice asked, bewildered. "It's the floor plans to Marcus's new chapter," I replied calmly. I continued my slow, methodical orbit around the massive dining table. I placed a thick, sealed manila envelope in front of Uncle Richard. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. I dropped one in front of Cousin Sarah, then Cousin Greg, and then Aunt Beatrice. I moved with the calm, practiced rhythm of a blackjack dealer handing out the final cards in a high-stakes game. I didn't rush. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, I reached the head of the table. I dropped an envelope directly onto Marcus's dessert plate, right over the remnants of Sylvia's store-bought pavlova. The icing smeared against the heavy brown paper. Then, I placed the final envelope gently in front of Sylvia. "Go ahead," I said. I kept my voice steady. "Open them." Aunt Beatrice was the first to tear the seal. She pulled out the glossy, 8x10 photograph of Marcus standing on the porch of the new colonial, kissing the cheek of a heavily pregnant 25-year-old Pilates instructor. Beatrice gasped loudly, her manicured hand flying instantly to her pearl necklace. Uncle Richard was next. He pulled out the bank statements. He adjusted his gold-rimmed reading glasses, squinting at the highlighted lines. $40,000, Richard muttered, the confusion morphing into a deep, uncomfortable realization. "Yes, Richard," I said, projecting my voice so every single relative could hear. $40,000. Wired directly from my marital savings account to a title company in Sylvia's zip code. The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. You could hear the sudden, shallow intake of Marcus's breath. I turned my cold gaze to my husband. He hadn't touched his envelope. He was staring at me, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with a sudden, primal panic. The arrogant veneer of the visionary entrepreneur was entirely gone. He looked like a frightened little boy who had just been caught stealing from the collection plate. "What is this, Eleanor?" Sylvia demanded. Her voice wavered slightly, losing its usual theatrical command. She ripped open her envelope and pulled out the top document. It wasn't the photograph. I had arranged hers differently. It was the official mortgage application. "That, Sylvia, is federal bank fraud," I explained clearly. I leaned slightly over the table, making sure she couldn't break eye contact. "Your son, the genius architect of this new chapter, needed to qualify for an $800,000 mortgage. But since he doesn't have a job and you don't have the liquidity, he got creative. Sylvia stared at the paper. Her eyes darted frantically across the black numbers. He took the K-1 tax forms for my limited liability company. I continued, my words landing like heavy hammer strikes. He digitally erased my name. He inserted his own. He claimed my gross revenue as his personal income to secure a federal housing loan. And you, Sylvia, co-signed it. Their faces drained of color. The arrogant, triumphant matriarch was completely gone. In her place sat a terrified, aging woman realizing she was holding a live grenade. Marcus shot up out of his antique dining chair. Ellie, wait, please let me explain this to you. Sit down, I commanded. It wasn't a yell. It was a whip crack of absolute, uncompromising authority. He collapsed back into his chair as if his strings had been instantly cut. There is no explanation, Marcus, I said. There is only a paper trail. And yours is an absolute masterpiece of criminal stupidity. The extended family was frozen in total shock. Cousin Sarah was frantically flipping through the text message logs I had printed out. They were the logs where Marcus detailed his explicit plan to lock me out of my own house while plotting his fake separation narrative. You thought I was busy, I told him, pacing slowly back toward the heavy wooden door. You thought I was too wrapped up in my spreadsheets to notice you looting my life. You thought you could orchestrate a vicious smear campaign behind my back, paint me as the villain, and ride off into the sunset with my money and your mother's blessing. I stopped abruptly at the threshold of the formal dining room. I spoke with my attorney on Friday. I announced to the incredibly silent room. A forensic accountant is currently auditing every single penny you have ever touched during our marriage. The 3 credit cards you rely on to look wealthy are permanently suspended. The joint accounts are entirely drained. I have filed for an immediate emergency injunction to freeze the marital estate. Oh, and my corporate lawyers? They have already forwarded the forged K-1 documents to the mortgage lender's fraud department. Marcus buried his face deeply in his trembling hands. A pathetic, whining sound escaped his dry throat. Sylvia stood up abruptly, her hands trembling so violently she knocked over her crystal water glass. The iced water spilled rapidly across the mahogany table, soaking into the pristine white tablecloth. You can't do this, she hissed, her voice venomous, but shaking uncontrollably. He is your husband. You are destroying his life over a stupid mistake. He destroyed his own life, Sylvia. I am just providing the legal documentation. I looked around the room one last, final time. I looked at the aunts, the uncles, and the cousins who had whispered behind my back, who had eaten my food, who had sneered at my ambition while happily accepting the financial benefits of my labor. I wanted them to remember this exact moment forever. I packed my bags yesterday, I said, my voice eerily calm and perfectly resolute. I have safely relocated to a highly secure residence. Do not attempt to contact me at my office or my new home. Any communication moving forward will go exclusively through my legal counsel. We are entirely, permanently no contact. I turned sharply on my heel. I walked out of the formal dining room, through the grand foyer, and out the front door into the crisp, cool night air. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The fraudulent structure had completely collapsed, and I was finally, truly free. The drive to my new corporate apartment took 40 minutes. I rolled down the windows of the Porsche, letting the frigid autumn wind bite at my skin. It was the most exhilarating sensation I had felt in 5 years. I connected my phone to the car's Bluetooth and played nothing. I just listened to the engine hum. My phone began to vibrate violently in the center console. The caller ID flashed rapidly. First Marcus, then Sylvia, then Marcus again, then Uncle Richard. I watched the screen light up the dark interior of the car, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of peace. I tapped the screen once, activating the global block list my IT department had pre-configured for me. The ringing stopped instantly. The silence returned. It was a beautiful, expensive silence. The corporate apartment was a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the city skyline. It smelled like expensive floor wax and absolute silence. There were no dirty socks kicked under the sofa, no half-empty beer bottles sweating on the expensive quartz countertops, and no lazy man demanding to be praised for simply breath. I poured myself a glass of cold water, stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, and watched the taillights of the cars crawling along the highway below. For the first time in 5 years, my pulse was completely steady. I slept for 9 uninterrupted hours. Monday morning was not a day of mourning. It was the day the heavy machinery was officially turned on. At exactly 9 o'clock, my attorney, Diane, formally filed the petition for dissolution of marriage at the county courthouse. Simultaneous to the filing, the judge granted our request for an ex parte emergency protective order over all marital assets, freezing everything outside of my individual LLC's rating accounts. Marcus was legally boxed in. By 10:30, the locks on our marital home, my home, the one whose deed was solely in my name prior to the marriage, were entirely changed by a bonded locksmith. The security codes were wiped. The garage remotes were deactivated. I hired a private security firm to place a guard at the end of the driveway for the next 2 weeks. Marcus was officially a trespasser on the property he used to treat like a luxury, all-inclusive hotel. But the true masterpiece of my revenge wasn't the divorce filing. It was the bank. Financial institutions are remarkably devoid of empathy. They do not care about a mother's desperate desire for a golden grandchild, and they certainly do not care about a 34-year-old man's new chapter. They care exclusively about risk exposure, and forged federal tax documents present an absolutely unacceptable level of risk. When my corporate attorneys forwarded the doctored K-1 statements to the mortgage lender's fraud division, the response was swift and merciless. Mortgage contracts contain an acceleration clause. It stipulates that if the borrower misrepresents their financial status or commits fraud during the application process, the lender has the legal right to call the entire loan due immediately. On Wednesday afternoon, less than 72 hours after the disastrous family dinner, a courier arrived at the picturesque 4-bedroom colonial. He handed a thick legal packet to a very confused, very pregnant Chloe. It was a formal notice of default and intent to accelerate. The bank wasn't just canceling the mortgage, they were demanding the immediate repayment of the $800,000 principal. Marcus didn't have $800,000. He didn't even have $800 to his name, considering his credit lines were dead and his access to the marital funds was legally severed, which left Sylvia. Sylvia had co-signed the loan. In her arrogant haste to secure a legacy, she had legally bound herself to her son's fraudulent debt. When the bank called the loan, they didn't just look at Marcus's empty pockets. They looked at Sylvia's assets. They looked at her sprawling Tudor-style home. They looked at her retirement accounts. The liability was joint and several, meaning the bank could go after either of them for the full amount. And Sylvia was the only one with actual capital. I received a detailed update from Diane on Thursday morning. The panic in Sylvia's camp was palpable. Sylvia had desperately attempted to hire a high-powered defense attorney, only to discover that liquidating assets to pay a massive legal retainer is incredibly difficult when a major financial institution is preparing to place a lien on your primary residence. Marcus, meanwhile, was experiencing the rapid, brutal deflation of his manufactured reality. Without my platinum cards, his lifestyle evaporated overnight. He couldn't pick up the tab at his expensive client dinners. He couldn't pay the monthly lease on the Range Rover, which was predictably repossessed from the driveway of the Colonial exactly 2 weeks later. The forensic accountant Diane hired completed his preliminary report by the end of the second week. It was a fascinating document. It revealed that Marcus hadn't just stolen the $40,000 for the down payment. Over the course of 3 years, he had slowly, methodically siphoned off nearly $60,000 additional dollars in small, untraceable cash withdrawals, funneling the money into a secret, low-tier checking account he used exclusively to romance his mistress. He had bought her jewelry, paid for her Pilates certifications, and funded lavish weekend getaways, all while complaining to me about how tight the consulting market was. I learned through the inevitable grapevine a loose-lipped cousin who tried to email my assistant begging for a corporate job that the atmosphere in the new house had turned deeply toxic. Chloe had been sold a very specific fantasy, a wealthy, successful entrepreneur who was rescuing her from her modest life. She thought she was moving into a secure, luxurious future. Instead, she found herself trapped in a house facing imminent foreclosure, chained to a man facing potential federal indictment, with an overbearing mother-in-law who was suddenly terrified of losing her own retirement. When Chloe discovered the truth not just about the foreclosure, but about the fact that Marcus was entirely financially dependent on the woman he claimed was abusing him, the illusion shattered. The golden child was suddenly revealed as a broke, desperate fraud. Sylvia, in her panicked attempts to save her own home from the bank's wrath, turned viciously on Chloe, blaming the young girl for ruining her son's life. The gaslighting Marcus had used so effectively on me didn't work on the bank. He couldn't charm his way out of wire fraud. He couldn't use corporate buzzwords to satisfy an underwriter's demand for capital. He tried to reach me, of course. He used burner phones. He tried emailing my company's general inquiry inbox. His messages were a pathetic oscillation between begging for forgiveness and seething rage. In one email, he pleaded with me to drop the fraud report, claiming I was ruining an innocent baby's life. In the next, he accused me of being a cold, calculating sociopath. He demanded I release the joint funds so he could defend his family. I forwarded every single communication to Diane. I didn't reply. I didn't engage. The boundary was absolute. No contact means no contact. You do not negotiate with a parasite once you have successfully removed it from your system. You simply watch it wither in the sunlight. The deposition took place on a dreary Tuesday in late November. The conference room at Diane's firm was a masterclass in psychological intimidation. It was freezing cold, windowless, and dominated by a massive slab of polished concrete that served as a table. There was nowhere to look but directly at the consequences of your own actions. Marcus arrived 20 minutes late. The man who walked through the heavy glass doors was a ghost of the arrogant entrepreneur I had lived with. He looked haggard. His designer suit hung loosely on his frame, clearly unpressed. The golden child had lost his luster. Sylvia arrived separately, flanked by a discount attorney who looked like he would rather be anywhere else on earth. She did not look at her son. The united front they had, so proudly displayed at that disastrous family dinner, had completely dissolved under the crushing weight of joint and several liability. When the threat of poverty enters the room, loyalty is usually the first casualty. I sat next to Diane, perfectly still, my hands folded on the table. I wore the same navy silk dress I had worn to the dinner. I wanted the visual continuity to anchor them to the moment their world ended. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just watched. Diane was a surgeon with a dull blade. She didn't rush. For 6 grueling hours, she walked Marcus through every single agonizing detail of his financial betrayal. She presented the forged K-1 tax documents. She presented the bank transfer authorizations. She presented the $60,000 in cash withdrawals, meticulously tied to hotel receipts and jewelry purchases for Chloe. "Mr. Sterling," Diane said, her voice a flat, deadpan drone. "Can you explain to the court how a man who reported zero taxable income for 3 consecutive years managed to fund a luxury weekend in Aspen, while simultaneously claiming his wife was financially abusing him?" Marcus stammered. He looked at his own attorney, a public defender type he had managed to scrape together, who simply offered a grim, unhelpful shrug. I was using marital funds. "I thought I had a right," Marcus mumbled, staring at the concrete table. "You thought you had a right to forge federal documents?" Diane countered instantly, slapping a high-resolution copy of the altered loan application onto the table. "Is that your testimony under oath, Mr. Sterling?" "No," Marcus whispered. Then came Sylvia's turn. Watching a narcissist attempt to navigate a trap they built themselves is a profound psychological study. Sylvia, realizing that her own Tudor home was on the verge of being seized by the bank to cover the fraudulent colonial mortgage, did exactly what parasites do when the host begins to die. She detached. Under oath, Sylvia threw her golden child entirely under the bus. She claimed she had no idea the tax documents were forged. She testified that Marcus had assured her the LLC revenue was his own, and that she had only co-signed out of a mother's blind love. She painted herself as the ultimate victim of her son's deceit. Marcus listened to his mother, the woman who had orchestrated the entire affair, who had cheered on his mistress publicly disown his actions to save her own skin. I watched his face drain of color as the ultimate betrayal registered. The alliance was dead. The fallout from that deposition was swift and legally absolute. Faced with the mountain of undeniable evidence and the looming threat of a federal wire fraud indictment from the mortgage lender, Marcus's legal counsel advised him to surrender completely. In the divorce settlement, I retained 100% of my business assets, the primary residence, and the entirety of my investment portfolios. To satisfy the marital dissipation claim, the $100,000 he stole for Chloe, and the house, Marcus was forced to forfeit his entire claim to any alimony or spousal support. I walked away completely whole. But the bank was not finished with the sterlings. The acceleration clause on the colonial was executed. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. Sylvia, desperate to avoid a catastrophic hit to her credit and the forced auction of her own assets, was forced to liquidate her retirement portfolio at a massive penalty. It wasn't enough. In a supreme act of poetic justice, Sylvia had to put her beloved Tudor-style home on the market. She listed it at a premium, hoping to salvage some pride. But the market is ruthless. It sat for 90 days. Eventually, she sold it at a 30% discount to a commercial developer who planned to tear it down and build luxury condos. She was forced to move into a tiny two-bedroom apartment in a deeply undesirable neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. As for Chloe, the illusion of the wealthy, rescuing prince was completely shattered. When the bank locked the doors of the Colonial and the Range Rover was repossessed, the romance mysteriously evaporated. She packed her bags, moved back into her parents' cramped basement, and filed for primary custody and child support before the baby was even born. A child support order against a man with no income, no assets, and a pending federal fraud investigation is essentially worthless paper, but it cemented Marcus's total ruin. He was left with absolutely nothing. No wife, no mistress, no house, no mother to bail him out. He moved into a cheap motel, paying week to week by liquidating the few luxury watches I hadn't bothered to reclaim in the divorce. The smear campaign they had planned to launch against me never materialized. The family members who had sat at that mahogany table, who had sneered at my ambition, suddenly went completely silent. They didn't call. They didn't text. The paper trail had terrified them all. They realized that I was not a woman who played by their petty, passive-aggressive rules. I was a woman who established boundaries with a legal barricade. I drove past the empty lot where Sylvia's house used to stand a few months later. The massive oak trees had been bulldozed, replaced by orange construction netting and the deep gouges of excavators. I pulled my car over for a brief moment and rolled down the window. I expected to feel a sense of triumphant glee, or perhaps a lingering sting of bitterness over the wasted years. But I felt nothing of the sort. The space where the anger used to live was completely clean, swept out and sanitized by the pure, unadulterated execution of justice. The architecture of their deceit had been leveled to the foundation. I put the car in drive and merged back onto the highway, accelerating toward my future, leaving their wreckage squarely in the rearview mirror. The criminal justice system, unlike family court, does not grade on a curve. When a major financial institution flags a fraudulent loan application bearing digitally altered federal tax documents, the gears of the federal machine begin to grind. They grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Marcus was formally indicted for wire fraud. I didn't have to testify at a trial. Confronted with the digital footprint of the altered PDFs, which the forensic cyber experts easily recovered from the hard drive of the home desktop he had left behind his public defender aggressively pushed him to take a plea deal. He managed to avoid federal prison, a mercy I attribute entirely to the fact that he was a first-time offender and the bank had successfully recouped its capital by foreclosing on the Colonial and forcing Sylvia's hand. But the plea deal came with 3 years of supervised probation, a staggering amount of court-ordered restitution, and a permanent felony conviction on his record. A felony record is the ultimate corporate kryptonite. The man who had spent 5 years dressing in bespoke suits, attending networking retreats, and throwing around buzzwords about synergy and angel investors was now completely unemployable in the financial or consulting sectors. The last I heard through the grapevine, Marcus was working as a shift manager at a mid-tier automotive parts warehouse, driving a beaten-up Honda Civic that he struggled to insure. The golden child had finally been forced to join the real world, and he arrived completely unequipped to survive it. Sylvia's downward spiral was quieter, but perhaps more psychologically devastating. She was entirely isolated in her cramped apartment. The extended family, the aunts, uncles, and cousins who used to flock to her Tudor mansion for free meals and perceived status, completely abandoned her. Narcissists only possess value to their enablers when they have resources to distribute. Once Sylvia's wealth was stripped away by the bank to cover her son's fraudulent debt, she became nothing more than a bitter, impoverished woman with a criminal son. The smear campaign she had plotted against me had ironically manifested against her, executed by the very family she thought she controlled. As for me, my life expanded in the exact proportion that theirs collapsed. Without the dead weight of a parasitic husband draining my accounts and demanding my emotional energy, my commercial real estate firm experienced its most profitable quarter in company history. I bought a new corporate headquarters. I took a month-long vacation to the Amalfi Coast. I rebuilt my savings, entirely untouched and inaccessible to anyone but myself. People who hear fragments of this story sometimes ask me how I walked away so cleanly. They ask how I managed to pack my bags, hand over the evidence, and initiate no contact without a single screaming match or a tearful breakdown. I tell them it's because I learned a few very harsh, very permanent truths about human nature. First, never underestimate the power of absolute silence. When you discover a betrayal, your instinct is to confront, to scream, to demand an explanation. But confronting a manipulator only gives them the opportunity to construct a new lie, to gaslight you, and to hide their assets. Silence is a weapon. It allows you to gather your evidence in the dark, to build your paper trail, and to strike only when the trap is completely secured. Second, if someone reacts violently or manipulatively to you establishing basic boundaries, especially financial ones, it is because their entire survival strategy was predicated on your lack of them. Marcus and Sylvia didn't love me. They loved the access I provided. The moment I removed the access, the illusion of family shattered. Third, the concept of the golden child is not a badge of honor. It is a form of parental sabotage. By shielding Marcus from every consequence, by funding his failures, and by actively participating in his delusions, Sylvia didn't create a successful man. She created an arrogant, dependent fraud who was so completely disconnected from reality that he thought he could outsmart the federal government with a fake PDF. Enabling isn't love. It is the architect of ruin. And finally, always trust the paper trail. People will lie to your face with absolute conviction. They will cry, they will swear on the lives of their unborn children, and they will manipulate entire rooms of people to believe their false narratives. But bank ledgers do not lie. IP addresses do not lie. Wire transfers do not lie. When the emotional noise becomes deafening, look at the math. The math will always tell you exactly who you are dealing with. I didn't lose 5 years of my life to a mistake. I invested 5 years into learning exactly how to protect my empire for the rest of my life. I amputated a diseased limb, cauterized the wound with legal fire, and walked away stronger. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.